This is Bad Pete No, and in tonight's Dyson Sphere Program video, we're going to be reviewing this build right here. This is my first black box build. It's going to enable you to produce 60 universe matrix per minute. It is fully self-powered, does not require gas giants or rares. This can all be done in your starter system, and everything that you need is either going to be on your starter world, or it's the titanium and silica that can be found on the adjacent planets. Nothing goes above tier 2 tech, so the basic idea behind this is that it's going to be your Kickstarter to get you from that mid-game into that later end-game good that we all want to get to. So this video is going to be a little bit on the longer side, so I'm breaking it into a couple of chunks. The timestamps for that are going to be on the screen right now. First, we're going to cover what you need to get it up and running, the boots, the boot time, the cost considerations, how much Dyson Sphere power you need. Then we're going to talk about black boxing in general, how and why I built this. And what my philosophy and approach behind it was. Then we're going to do a walkthrough of some of the cooler elements of the build, and I am going to credit the one blueprint that I did use from DysonSphereBlueprints.com as a contribution to this build. We do like to give credit where credit is due. And yeah, then we're just going to talk about the nuance and minutia of the game. So let's jump right in. So I've got another sandbox all locked and loaded and ready to go. Basically, I have a planet that I've paved over here, and on an adjacent planet, I have all of the raw materials queued into ILSs ready to be shipped over here. So you might be able to tell by this screen right here that I did a lot of iterations to get to this point. Now, when you do try to drop this blueprint, one thing to call out is that notice that sorter in the middle there that's being a little bit fussy with me. You got to line it up just right. The ILSs should be on the prime meridians there, but one of them is like the most primey of the primes. You can see it when you're in blueprint mode, but got a lot of heartburn trying to get that one sorter to line up for that central sun. In hindsight, I probably should have put something else there. But I've also got my logistics or my construction drones spammed to their most enthusiastic level of technology. Obviously, that's not necessary to build this thing. I just like watching them fly around real quick and just spamming out this build as fast as the game actually allows. Post-production Pete here. I did forget to mention the research that you'll need unlocked for this build. Obviously, you've got a lot that's required. The only thing that's really optional that I did was the logistics capacity and speed upgrades that require yellow science or less, and I did not do ray receiver efficiency or fidget spinner upgrades. Now to boot this up, we do have one artificial star way over here by itself. I did want to have them all in the middle, but 5 was just not quite enough to power the whole thing. And we're going to want to get out of F11 mode here. So to boot this guy up, we're going to throw about half a stack of antimatter fuel rods in this one that's off by itself. Fly on over to the middle and drop about 2.5 stacks right there in this middle storage unit. And that's really going to be all you ever need to do besides supply this with raw materials. It should gradually get enough limping by to kick on those other 4 stars. We can see that their second one's lit up right now. And now we just start clicking away all the milestones and all the different notifications from our little helper robot up in the corner here. And gradually watch as this thing comes to life. Now, it does take a little while to boot up. So we're at the 38-minute mark. I would expect that we'll see our first universe matrix being produced in about 5 to 6 minutes here. But a lot of things are sharing resource lines, specifically refined oil, also things like titanium crystals. And it takes a little while for the buffers to kind of fill up on that. So you'll observe that it does take a little while before it starts consistently producing everything at the expected rates. Plastic is particularly a jerk just because of trying to get all of these crammed into this spot. And so I've got, sorters feeding to belts, feeding to, really far apart sorters. So it will create the perception initially that it is not running at full speed, but once it's managed to buffer itself properly, that shakes out. And at around the 30-minute mark, you'll find that it does start producing at full throttle. Now, another thing to bear in mind is that this does consume about 3.5 antimatter fuel rods a minute, and it produces around 5 antimatter fuel rods per minute. This does not create any hydrogen balance issues. There are 0 byproducts to this system, although technically you could say that there are. It does produce an excess of antimatter fuel rods. It will not cause the system to break down should you produce too many. And I did not set this to do it by default, but you could always set one of these to supply to Icarus. You could crank up the storage on this, as it will be producing about 1.5 more fuel rods than you actually need. So you could use this as just a backup supply for Icarus, but don't plan on using it to power any other systems. Additionally, in sandbox mode by default, you can't. I don't even know if you can do this in vanilla, but you can't tell it, oh, I don't need 100 logistics drones in here. But really, you probably don't. You probably need like 20 or so. But I felt that it was better to just have them preloaded. But if you do want to keep the cost of this build down, you could be a little bit more conservative in your usage of drones. Now, as another factor that's going to affect your boot up time is how long it takes these ray receivers to come up to 100%, as that's going to impact the rate at which they're producing critical photons. The expectation is that provided that your planet's not wonky, lopsided, tidally locked, don't know why you'd be wasting a tidally locked world on a build like this, you should be able to get your ray receivers running at 100% continuous efficiency regardless of the rotation of the planet, whether it's summer or winter, provided that it's your normal, typical, not a weirdo planet. But it will take about 15 minutes for these to throttle all the way up to 100%. Now, at that point, assuming that you have no ray receiver efficiency upgrades, you are going to be consuming 3.15 gigawatts of Dyson Sphere power. You can get that down to about 2/3 that amount by leveling up your ray receiver efficiency. And we'll go more into the details about certain design considerations, like the fact that these purposefully do not use graviton lenses in subsequent sections of the video. But lastly, cost considerations. So I wanted to make this build as efficient and as easy to spin up as possible. So we do not use any tier 3 technologies. So we're not using the tier 3 assemblers. We're not using tier 3 belts. In fact, we're not using tier 1 anything, with the exception of 2 tier 1, or actually 8 tier 1 sorters are used in the entire build. But other than that, I tried to really pull the punches, especially on more expensive elements like logistics, ILS, PLS. I didn't really worry about the fidget spinner ones. They're pretty cheap. We are not using the quantum flavors of the chem power plants, and I'm using fractionators instead of fusion miniature particle colliders, not because of the concerns with hydrogen, but more because of the concern in the cost of constructing this. So other than these, the miniature particle colliders, the ray receivers, and the logistics towers, I would say that everything in here, although kind of spammy and you do need a lot of it, is all pretty cheap. And I will pop a screenshot up here real quick right now to show you what you're actually going to need to drop this. And this is going to be everything included in the build with the exception of your logistics itself and the initial 3 stacks of antimatter fuel rods to kick this off. Now, a little bit of a chicken and the egg thing. You do need to have a Dyson Sphere to get this to work, but you need the kind of power levels that the Dyson Sphere provides to create a Dyson Sphere. So I leave that up to you. Perhaps in a subsequent video, I will do some sort of sphere builder black box. Although there's a lot of really good stuff on DysonSphereBlueprints.com. And I would actually argue that building the first sphere yourself and getting it up and running is one of the more rewarding challenges of the game when you do get to that. So next, we're going to continue to let this run so that we can count our milestones. And we're going to start talking about some of the design considerations. So again, what is a black box? A black box is a fully contained ideally a single blueprint unit that's going to be purpose-driven. It's going to produce typically only one item. And there we go. Our first universe matrices are powering up right now as we speak. They're going to be purpose-driven. They're going to have a single goal in mind in most cases. And they ideally should be self-powered, although I've seen plenty of black boxes that are not self-powered. I consider that kind of a nice-to-have feature. So I wanted to push myself. For example, this is my first implementation of Sushi Belts, which we'll get into in a little bit. And so I thought that, best way to really take my game to the next level would be to challenge myself to create this build so that I could share it with the community. And just set a bar, and that way I knew I could take it a little bit further. But there were a few other limitations that I placed on myself for the design. So for example, yes, I'm aware that you can put storage units directly on top of splitters and feed your fidget spinners directly into them so that you can distribute at belt speed instead of at sorter speed. But that feature came out midway through me designing this, and I was just like, you know what, we got enough going on. Next. Probably the greatest flaw in this design is that I am not using any proliferation whatsoever. So the ratios for this are kind of tricky to lock down. I didn't want to overly complicate things, add additional complexities to the already spaghettified belting that's going on here. So no, this is not proliferated whatsoever. That is kind of a drawback to it and will ultimately be kind of a nerf to its ultimate efficiency. Because after all, this whole thing's powered on coal and crude oil, more or less. So you're using up about half of your starter world's maximum capacity for crude oil to keep this thing running. You need about, I think it's 27 per second. To keep this guy running, which is about half of what the starter world is going to start off with. And then gradually that's going to deplete over time. So ultimately that's what's going to cause this to break down and not be able to run at 100%, is that it is crude oil powered. But until it reaches that threshold, and by the time you do hit that threshold, you've probably moved on to bigger and better things. Additionally, I really wanted to focus on my nemesis hydrogen balance in this. So we have exactly the correct amount of hydrogen being produced. Every little tiny bit is being factored in. So even if we swing on over to wherever it is that I put them, these guys right here. So the antimatter fuel rods that are used for the power system, these are actually hydrogen zero. They do not create a byproduct of hydrogen, although you might think so because they consume graphene, and I will get into that in a few more minutes here. But this guy right here that's producing the antimatter for our white science does produce a tiny trickle of hydrogen, so that is actually factored into the calculations of what this thing needs per minute and per second even. And then another interesting bit right here. So you may wonder why there is this 3-belt yellow sorter going on right here. This is purposeful. It is to nerf this one smelter. And it's specifically because I need exactly 28.5 graphite smelters running in order to keep this thing operating. So we're using, basically for the main build itself, we're using plasma refining and X-ray cracking exclusively, and then supplementing by smelting coal to get the additional graphite that we needed. But because the graphite, refined oil, and hydrogen are all part of that multi-output problem, we needed to ensure that we were not going to overproduce graphite, which would eventually result in a bottleneck, which would eventually cause the whole thing to break down. So to ensure that, we do have this one little splitter right here. I strongly recommend against upgrading this particular splitter unless you want the whole thing to break. Similarly, I wouldn't bother upgrading any of this at all. It's not going to run more efficiently because you can't upgrade your oil refineries. You could swap these out for plain smelters, but then they're going to overproduce. They're going to create an imbalance in the system, and the whole thing is going to break down. So now we're going to take a look at Factorio Labs. Factorio Labs is your friend, and if you've never used it, I definitely would suggest checking it out. But like most good friends, it takes a little while to get to know, and some of the more finer nuances are still lost on me. So for example, Factorio Labs has this way of thinking that it knows best when it comes to what you want your oil processing to look like. And I disagree. I want to do things my way. Maybe it's less efficient, maybe it's more efficient, but it's my way, it's my build. And so what I did to kind of get around that was I told it specifically what I wanted for my producers. So we're actually using, for just the universe matrix, we are using a ratio of 47 to 25 plasma refining to X-ray cracking. And then we additionally have a 1-to-1 ratio of plasma refining and reform refine so that we can get that hydrogen neutral antimatter fuel rods. And basically then after that, it's just a whole lot of studying, a whole lot of note taking, a whole lot of iterating again and again and again and again and again until you finally get things right. As we can see here are the raws that it takes to actually power this. The buildings that we actually need. The coal and the iron are kind of gobble things up a little bit, but you should have no trouble finding adequate iron in your main system. I have found starter worlds where you will have a difficult time getting 57 silica veins. So that could potentially be an issue for you trying to get this to run in your particular starter system. But there's always silica in the stone veins. If you are patient and you want to spam out enough smelters, you can get the silica that you need. This actually makes a really good opportunity to detour and give credit where credit is due. I am assuming that the name of this user is pronounced faux pas. And this is just a really slick design. And I wanted to come up with something of my own for fractionators. But and I was just kind of flipping through for inspiration. And once I saw this, I could not unsee it. This is probably the simplest, most elegant and efficient design for fractionating or fractionarity, for doing that thing that I have seen in the entire community. And the only change I really made to it was I nerfed it because this is all set up for tier 3 and I need tier 2. But basically I did start life with this blueprint and then adapted it as I go. So credit to faux pas, great design, and this is the sort of build that you should aspire to. Something simple, if you wish to share with the community. Something simple, something efficient, something elegant that kind of teaches design principles. So really slick build. Next, we're going to hop over and talk about the whole idea of hydrogen neutral antimatter, antimatter fuel rods. Now, yeah, you do have to produce antimatter, but you're producing that in a 1-to-1 ratio with hydrogen, and you're consuming it at the same levels. So really, the only hydrogen that you actually have to worry about for this entire thing is going to be for, don't know how these guys ended up in here. Oh, whatever. It thinks it's proliferated now. But really, you do need refined oil to make your sulfuric acid, and you also in turn need that sulfuric acid to feed into your graphene. Now, the thing about reform refine in a 1-to-1 ratio with plasma refining is that you end up with no hydrogen byproduct whatsoever. You only get the refined oil. So part of the key to keeping the ratios in balance here was isolating the hydrogen consumption and the imbalanceable materials in the power system from the rest of the build. So this is like the third or fourth iteration of like tearing it down and building it back and tearing it down and building it back that I went through to get to this final design. And in one of my first iterations, I was sharing hydrogen between the antimatter fuel rods and the main build. And the problem was that now I did have hydrogen byproduct in the form of antimatter fuel rods. And I observed that, even if I gave it 5 stacked large storage containers, after enough time, eventually the hydrogen fuel rods would overflow, back up the whole system, and then it would break. And that's like the dumbest reason for my build to not be solvent. So instead, the solution is that it will actually kind of self-buffer. And the way it does that is through the storage. As soon as the antimatter storage units are full, they're only set to a capacity of one slot. Same with the other one floating over by that little, by itself artificial sun. Then it's going to kind of back up and it's going to stop producing these. And none of the other materials, we're using iron, we're using copper, we're using all the regulars. It's not going to hurt anything because these are all single output materials, and we don't have to worry about it backing up and screwing up any of our oil refineries. The only oil refineries that are going to get clogged and stop running are going to be these. And you got one plasma refining pumping 100% of its output into the reform refine that only outputs a single product. So as long as these exist in 1-to-1 ratios, you cancel out that whole problem of hydrogen imbalance. Reform refine, in my opinion, is the most underappreciated recipe in the entire game. It's just fantastic, and it's like my favorite dirty trick for keeping that stuff out of sight and out of mind. So then we've got 5 of these ray receivers are dedicated to antimatter fuel rod production. We also have this one lonely little sulfuric acid and graphene chem plants over here, and this one little graphite smelter that is, again, completely separated from the rest of our fossil fuel consumption, because, again, we don't want this going back into the main circuit, or on a long enough timeline, the fact that we're consuming 3.5 on average fuel rods a minute and producing at a rate of 5 a minute, that will be the byproduct that breaks the system. And it's always just a matter of time. Now, maybe that length of time is going to be far longer than this build serves its usefulness, and you're just going to not need it anymore. But who knows? And I'm not designing with too many assumptions in mind here. Maybe this is your set it and forget it white science build so that you can go tinker with the finer mysteries of the universe. So I did want to eliminate those byproducts. Also, I really wanted to push myself with what I could do with belts. I did not use any belting blueprints as part of this build. Although I do have some in my blueprint books, it was primarily for study purposes. I watched Ludus's videos on belt bending probably about 1 million times, just trying to wrap my head around things. But all of this was done vanilla, using just copy and paste. I'd make a belt off to the side that did the thing I needed it to do, and then I'd paste it in, and a whole lot of fussing to get really tight stuff like this to happen, when you just really need to fit something in where it's going to fit. Along the way, I did learn that you can get away with some really messed up spaghetti tricks, where I was just like, I've known about diagonal belts and I use them occasionally, but like this, I got a diagonal sorter to work. Like, how did I get that to work, and why can I never reproduce it consistently? This is just a tangled mess, and I absolutely love it, but it does get the job done. Another thing that I really wanted to take on with this build that I've never done before was sushi belts. So back in 3 weeks after the game came out, I'm on my very first playthrough, and I'm just building my very first red matrix build. And I made the mistake of combining the outputs from the oil refinery because I didn't know how to set filters on sorters yet. I was that green. And the result was the whole thing ended up breaking down. because obviously you don't want that. And so when I did learn about Sushi Belts, it really did kind of intimidate me. And you know, here I am a couple of years later, finally getting around to trying them out, because it's something I really wanted to figure out, like take my belting to the next level. So the basic premise of a sushi belt is that you have suppliers and consumers. So in this case, we have our 6 suppliers on the left side, and we have our consumers off on the right. Now, it might look like a big tangled mess, but this actually unfolds into a single loop. The idea is that you have a loop that's continuously cycling from your suppliers to your consumers. And you want to make sure that you're just, you have filtered sorters that pull off of the belts at a higher rate than you're pushing back onto the belts. And that's the basic premise of sushi belting. And that's what allows us to ensure that if one particular material overproduces during a period of imbalance, that the belts don't get clogged up and the machine continues to do its job. I've got these pilers here too because, you know, initially I thought, you know, like when I was testing this, I wanted to really make sure that nothing was going to overflow. I don't think it will. And I left them in there just because, I mean, they kind of look cool. You know, they just add to the disco light effect of the whole process. Additionally, I did not want to have double stacked storage over here because I don't really need that big of a buffer, with one exception. All of these things come online at different rates. So we can see that, for example, the electromagnetic matrices, they start producing significantly earlier than anything else in the build. They're producing like within seconds of when you give this thing power. But you're not going to get green matrices producing at any kind of considerable rates until it's fully booted up. Now, unlike all of the other matrices, antimatter stores and stacks at 20. And I have observed that, you know, if I'm not careful about how I do it, this can overproduce. At one iteration of the build, I had screwed up and I had 30 ray receivers instead of the 15 that I needed. And this storage facility would actually overflow and would top out before the machine was fully booted up. This would result in a hydrogen deficiency because the miniature particle collider that was providing this antimatter would back up on itself. So my solution was I went with 2 high, and then I put the rest in there to make them symmetrical. So I did a lot of work with half height belts, even when they were completely unnecessary, just to kind of practice and you know, get my mojo with it. One refactor was I did end up having to jam all of this really ugly spaghetti in here, kind of as a last iteration, when I thought the thing was perfect, and candidly I did record the video before I realized, oh wait, no. I have 30 ray receivers. I need 15. Wow. Good job, Pete. So I went back and moved everything out and put these over here. And we can see that now these are just almost starting to get to capacity here. This right here is really one of the worst choke points for the buffering. And you will find that until everything is fully booted up, it's going to look like this chem plant is underproducing. So we can see we're almost, you know, almost there. And this thing's been running for a little while now, but we're still not quite producing at a rate of 100 or at a rate of 60 per minute. It will get there eventually. Take my word for it. But, you know, I would say before you think the whole thing's not working, let it run for a full hour. See where it's at then. Another piece that I wanted to call out that I did really like the way it turned out was the Casimir crystal section of the build. So this is 4 modules in a repeating pattern. The module includes space for, so it's this guy and then these 3 assemblers off to the right here. And then just to ensure that everything's getting enough hydrogen, because a single green sorter is going to be able to get exactly enough hydrogen to keep the Casimir satisfied, and they will compete with each other, where because they'll try to buffer in a little bit more than they need in any given moment, and the result is that one will have slightly more than it needs, while one all the way down at the end will be ever so slightly starved and will be running at like 99.5% efficiency, which is, believe it or not, enough to throw the whole thing out of whack. So my solution is that I do just have some splitters buffering the full belt of hydrogen needed to keep this guy running. Again, just, had a lot of fun with, getting everything to tangle around this splitter in the smallest amount of space possible. You can see that it wraps around the back here and delivers to this one right here. And then I wanted to get these as tight as possible and only have this 2 wide gap right here. So that's why we've got this little wiggle action that goes on where I love this. It's just kind of like it has to be one height or one level high to get through here, but it has to be exactly at ground level to get through here, and then make it back up to one height to get back over the next one. That was kind of fun. So not this is also purposeful in that I need to take every third Casimir and put it into each of these evenly. So this will, naturally just kind of rotate 1, then 2, then 3, then 1, then 2, then 3, making sure that these guys also don't fight over their very meager resources. Then another spot that I had a lot of fun with was, or more, took me a while to kind of get the hang of. We have the same problem when it comes to the particle containers, which I call pink space baby tubes. Don't know why, that's what I call them. You need exactly 60 of these a minute, and it's not something you want to risk overproducing. I don't want to produce I don't want to overproduce anything in this build, because then we're just wasting we're wasting power, we're wasting footprint in land, and we're wasting initial build cost. But specifically, these you need to pump exactly 4 of those into 4 of these, and without having a 1-to-1 feeding system, but still having them all share the same line, I was running into problems where the earliest particle collider was kind of over consuming because it wants to have that little bit of a buffer, and it was resulting in the ones further down the line getting a little bit starved. No matter how long I ran it for, they would never seem to catch up. So my solution was just have a series of splitters and then cascade these lines down to make sure that everything is getting exactly 25% of what's coming in on that line. There's a couple other places throughout the build that I had to do some similar tricks. Another place that I will call that out and just, oh my gosh, the tangles. It's just spaghetti everywhere. So another place where I had to do something very similar is over here. So this is a 3 wide gap purposefully. The reason why is because I got 60 plastic a minute going off to feed my particle, cable, whatever, the blue stuff that you need for purple science. And all of the rest of it needs to go and do other things, largely graphene, I think. Forget off the top of my head. But the flaw to that, and I don't think I actually need this one, but guess what? Yeah, I totally don't need this one, but it's staying in there now. No idea why I did that. It was a late night. But this 3 wide gap is most definitely necessary, because that's going to give me the exactly 60 a minute that I need. Going off to one side, because I didn't want to have to run it all the way over here. Oh, right, for organic crystal, and then have whatever's left just continue to spaghetti its way all the way over to here. So instead, I just pulled off exactly what I needed. So using sorters at longer than 1 wide gaps is an interesting alternative to try and do crazy math with. Well, how many splitters exactly do I need to make this weird nonsense happen? Last thing I'm going to talk about is just the self-powering system. You actually don't need a ton to produce a steady trickle of antimatter fuel rods. Some of it's over here. Some of it's out here. It's kind of, I built it before I had closed in this initial ring, so I am considering doing another minimalist, antimatter fuel production. But again, the key thing here is using reform refine in conjunction with plasma refining is kind of the secret to being able to use crude oil to produce antimatter fuel rod, no rare materials, and not have to worry about imbalancing your hydrogen. And then initially, I thought I was going to get the whole thing in here, but it didn't quite fit. And so I ended up putting my titanium glass in here. Why? Because it was the only other things that needed the same materials that were already coming out of this guy. So yeah, again, I did really strive to keep the footprint as minimal as possible, as cheap as I possibly could. Working with round builds was also something that was kind of new and challenging for me. And so, if this does help you out, either from an I'm going to put this in my save, or from an inspirational context, happy to help. Please comment down below with what you would like to see me do more of. And if you did want to, hit the thumbs up or any of those other buttons down there, that does actually really help out a lot. I don't currently monetize. I don't really need the money, but I do like watching the numbers climb up. And every time I see I have a spike in views, it motivates me to make more of this stuff. So if you want me to make more of this stuff, there are buttons that can directly be used to encourage me to do so. So again, hope you liked what you saw tonight, and yeah, have a good one.